Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to come here. It's my first visit to Antigua, particularly Paget. Thanks so much for inviting me to come. I am aware of my responsibilities here in the fact that since we started the panel late, we are risking being over time. And so what I'm going to try to do is do a CLR James and say that I will speak for exactly probably 15 to 17 minutes or so. So we have enough time for conversation and we also get on track because with 5 panels this afternoon, it would be a problem if we run too much overtime on this particular one. So let me start at the inception of my paper with 2 quotes. And the first one should be a familiar one for us. It's from Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And it goes simply as follows. Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. The second quote is from CLR James's Party Politics in the West Indies. People of the West Indies, you do not know your own power. No one dares to tell you. You are a strange, a unique combination of the greatest driving force in the world today, the underdeveloped, formerly colonial colored peoples. Know that at this stage of world history and your own history, there can never be any progress in the West Indies unless it begins with you and grows as you grow. In 1961, a hemisphere apart, 2 Caribbean intellectuals made powerful statements about the historical conjuncture their communities inhabited, statements filled with a desperate urgency for the future of the anti-colonial revolution to which they had dedicated their lives. These were indeed heady times. A year previously, 17 African countries had gained their independence, while the Caribbean had been shaken by Cuba's revolution of 1959. Despite the collapse of the West Indian Federation, independence for the Anglophone Caribbean was on the horizon, with Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago gaining theirs in 1962, followed by Guyana and Barbados in 1966, and associated state status for much of the rest of the Anglophone Caribbean in 1967. Yet simultaneously, the tragedy of neocolonialism was never far from the surface. The Republic of the Congo's first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, had been deposed and murdered in a coup stage-managed by Western imperialism, while the nature and the demise of the West Indian Federation and the temper of the West Indian elites left no reason to believe that the quality of the Anglophone Caribbean's independence would be anything less than neocolonial. That CLR James and Frantz Fanon are perhaps the exemplary political thinkers of the Caribbean's 20th century is scarcely in doubt. Of their many fine contributions, I'm drawn to the urgency of 1961, the year in which both men came to a reckoning with their vision of a post-colonial order, its promise and potential despite the spectre of a creeping failure. Fanon wrote The Wretched of the Earth between April and July 1961, at an almost unbelievable pace, fueled by the need to complete it before leukemia ended his life, as indeed it did 2 weeks after The Wretched of the Earth's publication in Paris. CLR James's Party Politics in the West Indies, an account of his break with Art Williams's PNM in his native Trinidad and Tobago, was largely written in 1961, but published with the defiant introduction quoted above in 1962. Fanon would not live to see the culmination of the Algerian Revolution with which he had thrown his lot, dying mere months before Algerian independence. While in Trinidad, James, who in 3 decades of writing and activism had done so much to usher in Anglophone Caribbean's independence, would slip away from Trinidad a few days before its independence was celebrated. Now, both James and Fanon, in the epigraphs that I've cited, Fanon's, of course, quite famous, James less well known, speak about nothing less than the responsibility of the Third World for itself and for humanity. Neither of them spoke to a Third World intelligentsia that Fanon had dismissed in The Wretched of the Earth as, and I quote, spoiled children of yesterday's colonialism, end quote, a position that James would come to later at the 1969 Tricontinental Congress in Cuba, in which James would declare that the necessity for, and I quote, the abolition of the intellectuals as embodiment of culture. While Fanon's critique of the middle classes, who discover its historic mission, that of intermediary, between metropolitan power and the continued exploitation of the Third World is more devastating than James at this moment in their writings, it is in James's solitary critical engagement with Fanon that the weight of both men's perspective on the Third World's colossal importance becomes clear. In a January 1967 speech in Detroit, James would say the following of Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, and I quote, "Fanon was swept away by a certain conception, the necessity to finish off what is bound to corrupt and pervert the development of a colonial population. And the value of the book is not only what it says to colonials, it is recognized more and more by Europeans that something of this spirit is needed to rid from Western civilization the problems and the burdens that are pressing down humanity as a whole. Now, I think that this is a final stage that we have reached so far. I don't know where we will reach tomorrow. Fanon calls this book Les Damnés de la Terre. It's translated as The Wretched of the Earth, but I prefer The Condemned of the Earth, The Condemned of the World. I want to end by saying this. The work done by black intellectuals, stimulated by the needs of a black people, had better be understood by the condemned of the world, whether they're in Africa, the United States, or Europe. Because if the condemned of the earth do not understand their past and know the responsibilities that lie upon them in the future, all on the earth will be condemned. That is the kind of world we live in." End quote. Now, this knowledge and comment by James that the fate of the modern world lies with those who have been condemned by it, people who Sylvia Wynter once put it, have paid the most total psycho-existential price for the contemporary Euro-American West dominance, resonates today as clearly as it did half a century ago. We live in a world in which the sovereignty of third world states is consistently annulled by Western imperial aggression, from Iraq to Libya, and most profoundly, of course, in Palestine. A world in which neoliberal globalization's attempt to reduce the globe to the logic of the market, or as Pierre Bourdieu has put it, the utopia of unlimited exploitation, has engendered one of the most spectacular economic collapses in the century with no clear end in sight. We inhabit a time in which it's impossible to walk without being haunted by the loss of over 300,000 souls as a result of the January 2010 earthquake in Haiti, the greatest tragedy a Caribbean people have had to bear since slavery. And we also live in a time in world history, in which a bulletin of the atomic scientists has advanced its doomsday clock, which is their indicator of a likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe, to 2 minutes before midnight. And so the demand for ideas, movement, and activism for alternative futures beyond our present at times seems overwhelmingly intense. And it is at this particular point in conjuncture in which I would suggest we do well to recall the life work of Tim Hector, one of the most outstanding activist intellectuals of a post-independence Anglophone Caribbean, and a figure whose power, charisma, and authority recalls not only his mentor, C.L.R. James, but is also part of a tradition of public engagement which unfortunately seems to almost be rapidly evanescent in the contemporary Caribbean. Unlike many people here, I only met Tim once, but that was at the C.L.R. James Centenary Conference. And when I heard his speech at the C.L.R. James Centenary Conference, if you only met Tim once, I think that's not a bad time to have met Tim. And I'd like to put a proposition to you about the nature of the post-colonial Caribbean state, which Tim, of course, was so important in interrogating, and which I hope to work from in the rest of this paper. It is by now pretty well acknowledged that political regimes in the Anglophone Caribbean have what Paget Henry has put in a very interesting phrase, high legitimacy deficits. Okay? Practically every political theorist in the Anglophone Caribbean is using the language of crisis to define or describe what is the socio-political condition of a contemporary Caribbean state. So we have people like Brian Meeks referring to hegemonic dissolution. We have Tony Bowles talking about a Caribbean post-colony. Obika Gray speaking of predation politics. And it is this contemporary Caribbean moment which I personally have described as the coloniality of citizenship, by which I mean a complex amalgam of elite domination, neoliberalism, and a legacy of colonial authoritarianism that continues to frustrate and deny the aspirations of many Caribbean people. Hector's unique Jamesian approach to the critique of state power and the legacy of colonialism, and his presentation of alternative futures, is, I would claim, one of the most remarkable syntheses of a critique of a Caribbean state in the last generation. And Hector, of course, always presents with his critique alternatives. And during his Canada years, of course, he was part of what is arguably one of the most active sites of XL Anglophone Caribbean political activity in the late 1960s and 1970s. And I think that Matthew is going to take that up in his discussion, so I won't belabor you right there. But what I want to do in what remains is present really three moments in Hector's life work, which are hardly comprehensive because it's very difficult to be comprehensive about Tim, but nevertheless are indicative of the particular response that he fashions to the often bewildering and overwhelming post-independence moment with which he labored from 1967 to his death. And in thinking about this conjuncture that we're faced with, I actually want to quote two questions that the Guyanese political sociologist Percy Hinson raised about 10 years ago, which I think are acute discussions or descriptions of our post-colonial moment. And Hinson says the following: why are relations of domination and conditions of economic exploitation, that are little different and sometimes even more severe than those suffered under colonialism, understood and interpreted differently in the post-colonial era? And secondly, what explains the universal predisposition of those who engaged in and supported anti-colonial struggles to accept the conditions of post-colonial repression and exploitation? In other words, why is it that it seems that our politics has taken such a step back from where it was? Why do we actually support regimes that we would have denounced a generation ago as apologists for local and global apartheid? And in considering Hector's response to this, as I said, I'll draw on three writings, and these three are: one, his 1984 address to the OWTU, the Struggle for Caribbean Nationhood; the second one that I've chosen is his speech to the Caribbean Congress of Intellectual Workers, titled The Media and the Caribbean State, from 1982; and the third one is his One Caribbean as a Zone of Peace, his 2001 address. And for Hector, part of this bewildering coloniality that the Caribbean remains enmeshed with is simply the product of the fact that the Caribbean, unlike other ex-colonial societies, was not colonized, but for him was actually created by colonialism. Or to use James's words, in one of his more arresting phrases, he says that the Caribbean, more than any other society in the world, was constructed by history. And this construction by history means so, for Tim and also for James, that historical consciousness is one of the keys to liberation. And one of the most fascinating features, of course, of Hector's contributions is the fact that he's had this ability to meld historical fact to contemporary anecdote and use both as a means towards historicizing the present. So in his 1984 address at the OWTU, Hector spoke in a style reminiscent of Walter Rodney's Black Power lectures, but this periodization of Caribbean history is secured by crucial moments that announce a shift in labor's organization against exploitation since emancipation. So he'll speak then about 1834, 1865, Morant Bay, 1919, the period just after World War I, and Cipriani, the 1930s riots, 1959, and Castro, 1968. And in speaking of the right to vote, to unionize, and to publish newspapers, Hector criticizes a tendency to call them bourgeois rights. And I should note here that David Abdullah has already stole my thunder here by quoting this passage yesterday, but I was not to know that. And it's important enough that I'll quote it again. And this is his response to the tendency to call these bourgeois rights. They are wrong. The rights were won, secured, and gained by the struggles and sacrifices of the working people. Thus, for Hector, the Caribbean nation can only flower if foreign domination is overcome and its focus becomes not only producing not just for export, but for Caribbean industry and agriculture, and also to sustain the needs of Caribbean people, but also secured by certain rights and freedoms that Caribbean people have labored to create. Now, if history is a guide to conscious action, history as a guide to conscious action is a preoccupying subject of Hector's 1984 address, when it comes to the Caribbean Conference of Intellectual Workers, he gives one of his most lucid accounts of the medium through which he staked his claim as a radical Caribbean public intellectual. And that, of course, is the mass media, of which he was one of our most profound radical journalists. And I also want to note, I think it was mentioned yesterday briefly, that the Privy Council decision on his case is a landmark case in Caribbean jurisprudence on the freedom of the press. And I'm hoping that someone who is more familiar with that case can actually speak to us more about that later on today, because it was one of the many signal contributions that Hector's activism actually gave us. But if we go back to that 1982 address for the Caribbean Conference of Intellectual Workers, in this, Hector relies heavily on Fanon and his particular critique of the national middle classes to fashion his own critique of the Caribbean media. And he illustrates the class basis of their ownership, the profoundly reactionary character of their genuflection to Western imperialism, and the fact that they are not even really a bourgeois press, but according to him, they are a slavish media orchestrated by external forces to resist all change and to distort and twist the consciousness of a population with every publication, every broadcast, every telecast. That is what the Caribbean media, or the mainstream Caribbean media, means for Hector. News agencies are directly created to sustain capitalism, or to put it differently, the media are not controlled by large corporations. For Hector, this is a problem, that idea. The media actually are corporations. And if we understand that, we understand a lot more about the media, and we don't get into all of this nonsense about whether we prefer CNN to Fox News or whether the BBC is better than American media. The media are corporations. We know what to expect from corporations. It is a system then, to quote Hector again, that cribs and confines the peoples of a third world into increasing dependency and deepening underdevelopment. However, of course, along with this critique, he has a guide to action, and this is his solution. But by, with, and for the working people, we have to create newspapers, press agencies, radio and television networks in the region which reflect and develop the consciousness of the working people, and which people's media must at one and the same time challenge the national middle-class media, and through this confrontation allow the working people to become a class for itself, that is, capable of creating a new democracy at the point of production and in society at large. So whether in critique of contemporary Caribbean politics or metropolitan power, Hector always presents options rooted in the desire to deepen democracy. And we might claim that even this phrase, the democratic vision, has been so, maybe considered useless for radicals due to how abused it has been and how it has been distorted over time. However, if we actually borrow from James again, in Beyond the Boundary, we get a different definition of this idea of what the ends of democracy actually are. For James in Beyond the Boundary, the ends of democracy are the fashioning of a more complete existence, end quote. And for Hector, if we look at his essay on the Caribbean as a zone for peace, we can perhaps best see in this particular essay this wider vision that he has about how he's going to rescue, or suggest that we rescue, the Caribbean from the micro-colonial nationalisms and the imperial encirclement that actually subverts its sovereignty. With a tip of the hat to Morris Bishop, who he claims invented the term, Hector would state that the necessity of declaring the Caribbean as a zone of peace is not a pacifist position, but rather weds the historical consciousness to the critique of imperialism. The consequences of this declaration would be as follows. It would involve the removal of all foreign military bases from the Caribbean. It would mean a ban on the transshipment of nuclear waste through the region. It would also demand a recognition of and reparations for the genocide against indigenous peoples of the region and transatlantic slavery and colonialism's exploitations. Hector also reminds us here that Caribbean people have never fought a war amongst themselves, even though we may ponder Hector's omission here of the 1937 massacre of Haitians on the border of the Dominican Republic and exactly how he's defining and articulating a sense of violence within the Caribbean state and between Caribbean states. One Caribbean, though, as a zone of peace for Hector is, and I quote, a distinct and direct challenge to the militarized world order in greedy pursuit of more and more capital at the expense of humanity in the name of anti-terrorism and sham democracy. And in closing then, I'd like to provide a brief anecdote about how I first encountered Tim Hector. And I actually first encountered Tim, I realized this only when I started to write this paper, when I was 13 years old in 1989, when reading the Benson Hedges West Indian Cricket Annual, which I actually managed to dig up from my collection. And I encountered Tim here because I read his tribute to I.V.A. Richards on reaching a century of centuries, 100 first-class centuries. And reading this tribute again, just a couple of weeks ago, more than 20 years later after I had originally read it, I was struck very much at how similar in its rhythm it actually is to C.L.R. James's essay on Garfield Sobers of 1965. And again, how Hector is perhaps the greatest interpreter of James's ideas for a popular audience that we've actually seen in the Caribbean. And I want to actually quote one passage by Hector that describes Richards to make my point and conclude with this particular passage. Viv, as I see and react to him, has a majestic rhythm governing the slightest movement, which is present even on his unfruitful days. He does, of course, deviate from conventions to innovate and create, like the artist Vivi is, because, like the artist Vivi is, he cannot, simply cannot, go on taking the line of least resistance. So too, we might say of Hector's radicalism. Thank you.